And these were the giant animals, the megafauna, the huge reptiles, the wombats, the size of cars, the kangaroos, 3 times the size of the big reds we know today, and the rhinos and hippos, all of which once lived on this very continent, Australia's megafauna. And it wasn't all that long ago. So to tell us who or what they were and what happened to them, I'm joined by Danielle Clode. Danielle is a zoologist and science writer. She's an associate at the Department of Zoology at the University of Melbourne and is also a research fellow with organisations such as Museum Victoria. And they've published her latest book, Prehistoric Giants, the Megafauna of Australia. Oh, look at the beaut pictures. Danielle joins me from Melbourne. Welcome. Now, Danielle, you won't tell anyone about my giant wombats, would you? Because
I'm sure they'll be perfectly happy where they are.
Yeah, but just don't tell anyone. It's just between you and I. Now, what period of time are we talking about when these whoppers roamed our landscape?
Well, we're really talking about a time about 60,000 years ago, really, which is when the last of the megafauna were sort of just petering out and going extinct. So that's the period of time that I'm most interested in. Though a lot of them extended back a lot further than that to varying degrees, but their extinction is probably the defining moment, if you like.
So the great vanishing was over by when?
Probably a few of them lingered on for maybe 45,000 years ago, but probably they were all gone by then. So there's a little bit of overlap, and of course not all of them vanished entirely. Some of them just shrank. So we have we still have some of the remnants of the megafauna, if you like, because we've got the big red kangaroos and the grey kangaroos, which were around as megafauna. They were just quite a bit bigger then.
Yeah.
And they've shrunk down to a
The reason I was asking about the dates is I well remember my mate Tim Flannery getting into trouble on this very program a long time ago by suggesting that our megafauna got their comeuppance because of the arrival of our indigenous humans.
Yes.
And that didn't make him very popular with
Well,
indigenous spokespersons.
Yes, it's a very controversial issue. I guess, the thing is that we know just from recent history that humans don't have a particularly good record when it comes to making other animals go extinct. And the decline of the megafauna did coincide with the spread of humans around the world, not just in Australia. The same debates go on in America as well. So
humans arrive and species diminish. That's been a fact of life, hasn't it?
That's a general pattern. But of course we also have to remember that humans spread around the same time as climate change was occurring quite dramatically around the world as well. So you can't really take the two things away from each other. And
okay, well let's now follow that second line of thought. How different was the landscape in those far gone days?
Well, the sea level was lower for a start, so the mainland of Australia was connected to both Tasmania and to New Guinea. So Australia was a much bigger continent, and it was also much more forested in most of the time. So we had much bigger distributions of forests into the inland of Australia. So the arid region was much smaller, we didn't have as many grasslands, and it was quite a bit wetter.
And there were vast shallow lakes that stretch across the inland.
Yes, that's right, yes.
And now, is that the reason why there were these giant animals? That, when we're talking about megafauna, is there a weight scale that you're looking at? How big did they have to be included in your grouping?
Oh, the definition of megafauna is a little bit wobbly, I have to admit, and it differs in different countries. So Australia doesn't have particularly large megafauna on a global scale, so we tend to be a little bit more generous and let some smaller things in. So, we tend to be talking about animals over 40 to 60 kilos, whereas overseas they might push the scale up to 80 to 100 kilos.
And you make the point that, let's take an animal almost at random, take the koala, that the modern koala is only slightly smaller than the extinct species who weighed in at 13 kilograms.
That's right. There's quite a few species that, although they were larger, like Tasmanian devils and platypus and a lot of animals like that were larger during this period, they weren't a lot larger. They're still only small animals.
Danielle, when did we discover that we'd had them? Can we date that? When did someone first fall over a sizable fossil and say, ooh, that was a wombat?
Well, that would have been the Wellington Caves. So, quite early on. Mitchell, I think it was, went out in response to a friend of his who discovered some great big bones, which he thought were probably elephants or rhinos or things like the megafauna that had been recently found in Europe, because megafauna had only been relatively recently identified there as well. And the really interesting thing was that, of course, they're big beasts, but they're not at all the same as European animals, and they're actually giant marsupials.
In fact, I'm going to talk about them because this program is dedicated to the wombat. Now let's tell the listener about the giant wombat, because that was about the size of a grizzly bear, you suggest.
Yes, I think that's quite a good parallel to draw. And I think that's quite an interesting one too, because there's been a lot of discussion about whether giant wombats could have had burrows or not, and certainly they couldn't have had burrows with the length and complexity that modern wombats have, because as you know,
our ones burrow.
Yes, but they build amazingly long and complex burrows, the little ones.
No, but I'm talking about the big ones.
The big ones, okay.
Yeah. But they're not, I concede your point, they're not very complex structures, because the soils tend to collapse.
That's right, yes. So when you're a great big animal, it's rather hard to build a burrow that goes very far. But, grizzly bears do produce reasonably big burrows, and they're big enough to get into and nest in and shelter in. So I can't see why a giant wombat in the Pleistocene wouldn't have done the same thing. There's
some wonderful stuff in the book about kangaroos and some splendid illustrations. I should point out to the listener who doesn't live with kangaroos, as I do, that they're still pretty bloody big. And I had a run-in a couple of weekends ago with a kangaroo who was very cross with me. And when they're back on their tail rearing up, they are a spectacular sight.
They certainly are.
And it's hard to believe that there were kangaroos 3 times as big as my whopping eastern greys.
Even more worrying is the one that was carnivorous. Well, that's the one that bothers me. I don't like the idea of a carnivorous kangaroo very much.
No, I must say we've got rid of those at the farm. What about the dynamics of a kangaroo that big? Was it capable of bounding? And what about the engineering limits of sinews and muscle and that stuff?
Yes, I think they're still, using much the same form of locomotion. I haven't heard any calculations that would suggest otherwise. But one interesting difference, especially with the short-faced kangaroos, is their forearms. They actually had shoulder blades that rotated much the way human shoulder blades do, and unlike other animals which just sort of go forwards and backwards. So they had very flexible arms that could reach up into the trees to pull down branches and things in a very human-like manner. And I think it would have been really interesting, given that they also had the very squashed faces and short muzzles, unlike our modern kangaroos.
I'm sad to report that the megafauna at the farm no longer includes rhinos and hippos, and most listeners would be astonished to know that we ever had them.
Well, yes. We didn't. We often refer to them as Australian rhinos and hippos, but of course they're no relation at all to the African varieties. They're just filling a sort of similar ecological niche, as it were. They were actually giant marsupials, and they're quite unlike anything that exists today. So we have Palacestes, which was probably a bark-ripping animal, so it had great big hooked claws that it probably used to rip the bark off trees, and quite a long flexible tongue that probably used the same way that giraffes do to wrap around foliage and rip it off the trees.
Let's go back to the changing climate, because you write that as the climate grew drier and the aforementioned inland lakes evaporated, most of the species vanished from our shores. So you think it was primarily profound climate change?
Well, My area, I've worked quite a bit in conservation biology, I suppose, and one of the things that we know from modern conservation biology is even when you've actually documented the extinction of a species, it's very rarely attributable to a single factor. So even species that have gone extinct within European settlement in Australia, it's always a multiplicity of factors. So it's never just simply hunting or, it's always a combination of introduced predators, habitat degradation, vegetation changes, disease, all of those things operating together. So I'd be really surprised if you could pin any particular extinction on any one factor.
Danielle, what about our feathered friends? We haven't talked about birds, and many of those, of course, are capable of moving on or flying for long distances if habitats aren't too encouraging.
Well, that's the one feature of the Megafauna, is that big birds generally don't fly. So we had the last of the mihirang, which were a fantastic family of birds which had actually been around for an awfully long time and had in earlier times been considerably larger. But even at the end of the Pleistocene, we're still talking about a bird that's a little bit taller than an emu, but about 5 times as heavy. So
I'm looking at one of the illustrations of a very big bird which looks uncannily like, well, a contemporary duck.
Yes, well, they're most closely related to ducks, in fact.
Is that right? Well, that was what I was getting at about the kangaroo and the engineering principles. Clearly extremely large birds, find it hard to aviate. But surely there have been birds right through that era that have survived.
Yes, we do have there were, like the mammals, there were quite a few birds that were just that bit bigger than they are today. So a lot of the modern birds that we have today were around in this period as well. And they're either the same or they've just shrunk slightly. So, but a couple of forms are a bit different. So the kukul that's described in the book was a much bigger species than the modern kukul that lives in the rainforests up in Queensland.
How generous has the fossil record been?
Well, the fossil record's always a bit patchy, but having said that, there are some amazing treasures that have been uncovered over the years. So, in addition to Wellington Caves and places like that, the Nullarbor Caves and the Thylacoleo Caves in Western Australia have produced some amazing skeletons. And the cave deposits are particularly exciting, I think, because the species, the individual animals often fall into the caves and are left intact and sitting complete in the caves when they're found. So unlike, say, river fossils or whatever, where they've been washed down and disarticulated, these ones are intact and almost as the animal just fell into the caves.
Of course, some creatures have such delicate bones. I'm thinking of snakes, but there has been some pretty interesting fossil skeletons of these sinuous creatures. Yes,
the Naracoorte Caves have got Wanambi, the giant snake, which is a really puzzling specimen to find, and there are some really interesting
the reason it's odd is because it's very big but had a very small head, so it couldn't eat sizable prey, could it?
Yes, it makes you wonder, but of course, snakes have all sorts of strange ways of dislocating their jaws.
Yeah.
To take in prey, so who knows exactly what it did. I think it's more interesting what it tells us about the climate, because the indication is that it was quite cool at the time there, but there were obviously, it was quite a forested area as well, because there's remains of tree kangaroos from those same fossil deposits, so it was obviously quite a different habitat to what it is today.
We've still got some pretty large snakes in Australia, in the python, amongst the pythons, but what's the best guess of the maximum size of a snake in prehistoric Australia?
Well, the Australian snakes didn't get as large as some of the others overseas, but so the Wanambi probably wasn't quite as big as an anaconda, but it was getting up there for sure.
One of the great thrills for me is is I'll be wandering around and suddenly I'll come across what seems to me a huge goanna. It might be in the chook pen eating the eggs, or it might just be hanging around on a tree. And, some of them are bloody big, but how big were they in the good old days?
Well, the Megalania, the giant goanna in the Pleistocene, was absolutely enormous. And it's one of those fossils where we don't have a lot of remains, so it's...
There is a reconstruction at Museum Victoria, or is it a guesstimate rather than a fossil?
Yes, it is a reconstruction. I'm sure a very well-educated reconstruction, but yes, there isn't... I don't think there's a complete skeleton. There's a pretty good one in Queensland, I think they have, but there's still a lot of speculation, because, of course, even if you just find one specimen, you're still not sure how that fits into the size range of the species. And often what you might have is sort of an extra large toe bone, which you then have to scale up your existing specimen to see how much bigger it would have been if it had a toe bone that big. So
your splendid book explains, in effect, that all this fauna went on a diet with changing climate and started to reduce in size.
Yes, well, a lot of them did. A lot of the very large animals that lived in the forest just simply didn't have the habitat left, I suspect, to sustain their populations. And I think, animals like Palacestes, which was obviously highly specialised, weren't able to adapt and change to the changing climate. Whereas what we find is that the kangaroos, the modern kangaroos, which were grazing animals, were well suited to adapting to the grasslands as they expanded across Australia and became, the dominant species that we see today.
Can animals change fast enough in the current context for survival purposes? Because never in history, as far as one knows, has the change of climate been quite as rapid as it is at the moment.
Well, it probably depends upon their inherent flexibility. Some species are behaviourally very flexible and even physiologically quite diverse, so there's a great deal of variety within the species, and those are the species that are best able to change. So, your brown rat, for example, is a very behaviourally flexible animal that can
Danielle, while we're all thinking of rats, I'll take my leave of you because we're out of time. Danielle Clode, author and zoologist based at Melbourne Uni, her latest book, and it's splendid, Prehistoric Giants, the Megafauna of Australia, published by Museum Victoria, and called into the Melbourne Museum where they're showcasing examples in their new dinosaur walk